filmmaker and composer. His work has been featured on National Geographic, PBS, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Al Jazeera, Outside Magazine. It's been exhibited at the Smithsonian and screened at festivals and theaters worldwide. He has directed numerous films, including Earthrise, Sanctuaries of Silence, Mary's Dictionary, Isle de Charles, Yukon Kings, Solo, Elemental, Barrio at the Pass, and What It Would Look Like. I hope I didn't kill the pronunciation there, sorry. In 2005, he founded the Global Oneness Project, an award-winning educational multimedia platform, and he's currently the executive editor of Emergence magazine, a quarterly publication founded in 2018. And prior to his work in film, Emmanuel performed with some of the biggest names in jazz, as well as releasing 2 critically acclaimed records, Previous Misconceptions and Borrowed Times. Welcome. Next up is Paul Koretz. He is a writer, producer, and director based out of Yellowknife in Canada, Canada's Great White North. Jay runs one of the most unique production studios in Northern Canada, called Artless Collective, and is also the creator and president of the Dead North Film Festival, which is responsible for over 160 short circumpolar genre films. Welcome. Pablo Saravagna is the resident director of photography at Artless Collective. Born and raised in the Northwest Territories, Pablo is an active member of the media art community with 20 years of production experience. A sought-after Northern expert in documentary and factual TV, photojournalism, arts advocacy, and education, Pablo is personally interested in developing a healthy film and television scene and thriving art-filled North. He is also working to develop a sustainable and culturally significant film and TV industry in Canada's Arctic and to turn the fledgling Yellowknife Film Festival into a world's premier stage for circumpolar films. Welcome. Adam Baldwin is the Chief Programs Officer and Director at the Anchorage Museum in Alaska. In 2008, he moved to Anchorage and began his museum career. At the Anchorage Museum, he's worked as Visitor Service Manager, Enterprise Director, Director of Community Partnerships and Outreach, and now as the Chief Programs Officer and Director. The museum hosts a film festival each spring called North to North, and that is how they got in touch with Riff, and I will ask him to say a few more words about that when he's up there. Welcome. Vilborg Einarsdóttir has 30 years of experience with diverse work as High North media producer, specializing since 1996 in film and photography on extreme Arctic locations in Greenland. Productions include feature films, commercial documentaries, and photography projects. She headed the media production of the ATP project with awarded international journalists and documentarists. She is also founder and head of development of UNA. Vilborg has organized several PR and media projects and done Greenland consultancy for ministries and institutions. Her diverse production and journalistic work have all been High North or Arctic or culture and entertainment connected, except for 2007 to 10 when she took on an international motorsport management for Iceland's only Formula 3 driver, Kristján Einar. Welcome. And finally, Hlín Jóhannesdóttir is an anthropology and media graduate from the University of Iceland. She has worked in film production since 2000 as an associate producer, and co-producer, production manager, line producer, and partner at Zigzag Filmworks, a production company with more than 100 international awards, including Oscar nominations on its credits list. As a producer, Hlín has worked with many of Iceland's most successful directors on feature films and documentaries. She has also worked as a freelance writer for magazines and online news medium, and one of 2 founders of Vintage Pictures in Iceland, and owns the culture and art production house Ursus Parvus with Vilborg Einarsdóttir here in Iceland. Welcome, Hlín. So maybe we should start by just giving handing the word over to our panelists if they have any reflections on the film. Who would like to start?
Well, I can just start by saying that I was very happy to see a green Arctic and not white, because we don't see very many documentaries or short films or anything that shows us anything else but the great big whiteness of the Arctic. So that was interesting, and it was just a beautiful film.
Thank you.
It really was. And I loved the simplicity of it. And the fact that no one outside of those characters that the film was about was telling us anything or relaying any message, because the message was very clear just from their own thoughts. So congratulations on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would just echo Vilborg on this. It was, in its narrative simplicity, it was still saying a lot of things that you just take in, and this is themes that we are aware of today and have become more and more discussed, but this was in a way a different manner of showing us these themes of what is happening to our nature. So I appreciated that, but it was a beautiful, subtle, lovely film, and thank you. Congratulations.
Does anyone else want to add something here? Or?
Sure, I would like to further to that. I also enjoyed how it was the characters speaking for themselves, and not too much editorial sort of, nobody speaking for them, in particular with Indigenous stories and Indigenous voices. It's nice to give them some sovereignty over their own stories, and I like what you did there. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just echo exactly what you said. So.
Okay, thank you. So please raise your hand if you're in the room and you have a question or a comment or something you would like to add to the discussions. But maybe I will start. And my first question would go to Emmanuel. It says, why did you choose this topic? What inspired you to make the film? And were there any surprises along the way?
So the genesis of the film, which I made in 2012, so it's 7 years old, was I read a book about salmon fishing. And in the book, they talked about this community in Alaska on the Bering Sea, in this village called Immonik that had a fair trade fishery called Quickpack, which was the only fair trade fishery run by indigenous people in all of North America. And I was really intrigued just by reading about it. And also the story talked about how their way of life in Immonik was shifting as the salmon run was changing. And the amount of salmon that were on the run were changing and depleting each year. As it, the film says, since 1998, that's when they really started gathering the data, the amount of salmon has decreased. And in this village, as in many other subsistence communities in Alaska, and I imagine other parts of the Arctic, the dependence on fishing is part of their livelihood. It's connected to their culture. It's a source of food, source of income, force of connection to every aspect of their life. And so I was interested in trying to tell a story about the changes happening there in the Arctic. And talked to Quickpack Fisheries, and they invited me to come up and hosted me there. And I didn't have a character at the time. I didn't know anybody there. But I felt like if I went to the village there, it was very remote. It's one of those places you get on a small plane and then get on a smaller plane and then get on a smaller plane and then you're next to the pilot on the last flight. So it's very remote, but I figured that there would be people there who would be powerful characters, and I was interested in finding a family that was working. During the summer, they all go to fish camps away from the village. This is like 2 hours on a boat ride right by the Yukon River. People have fish camps, and just going to find families who are living that way of life and talking about the changes they're dealing with. And on the first day, we were out in a boat. After 6 hours on the river, we came across this boat, the family of the Waskas, and they were talking, and really right away I could tell that Ray, the grandfather, was a powerful voice, and asked if we could spend the day with him, and then by the end of the day he said, great, sure, you could film me, and we spent the next week with them, just as they fish and as they prepare the food for the summer. So it's a story of the film, and I was very moved to see how simple, as you said, their way of life is. Not simple in a way that I captured an essence, I think, that so many of us are trying to get back to, which is this bridge between how our culture is connected to our food and to our way of life. And they have it in such a beautiful, embodied way, and it's under threat from sources that they say are kind of like outside of their control: overfishing, climate change, all these things. And they're really at the edge of the world. This tiny little village somewhere, and they're feeling the effects of what's happening as a result of so many of the industrializations of the world. So.
Any hands? Yes? Please introduce yourself. And yes?
Oh, I'm John Peterson. Hello. I was wondering what the physical challenges and the equipment challenges were that were unique to the north in the standard film process. I imagine, you have dollies and things like that for tracking shots, and that's not really practical up north, or that your equipment must get, the threat is that it gets wet, and what are your color correction issues when you shoot a film up there? What is different about shooting up in the north than in a more controlled southern situation?
I mean, I should probably let these guys answer that, but because I shot in the summertime in the north. So, I mean, it was in the 30s and 40s, but it was not that harsh, and we had rain. And so it really was just, just like any other situation. I would just say it was just a pleasure to be in that light. That was what my takeaway was. But I've never shot in Arctic conditions with snow, so I'm sure these guys have a much better sense.
We definitely have. And it's brutal. Some of the things you have to look out for are like the back of your monitor, whatever monitor you're using, will start ghosting. The gel in the plasma screen will actually start to freeze, so you can't get your focus anymore. So we often have to put like hand warmers on the back of the monitor screen. When you're shooting outside for a long time with your camera, before you bring it inside, you need to put it in a garbage bag and tie it shut, because if you come inside right away, it'll instantly freeze up, like ice will form over the lens, and it'll be like that for 2 hours. So if you come inside quickly to go to the bathroom or get a coffee and you bring your camera in, you're screwed for the next hour or two.
Can I add a
Yeah.
little solution to that? Because
Please.
this was, as someone who's, I think, minus 32 plus wind chill is the lowest that I've had on any shoot. And of course, when I began doing this was just film, so then that was the battery headache the whole time. But to your particular problem, we, in my group and my former production company that was based more or less only in Greenland, we actually used condoms for the problem that you have. We had condoms that were over the lens as soon as you walked in, no moist, so now you know.
Wow.
Yeah,
So
Okay, duly noted.
yeah, so it worked.
Do you have to get
Yeah.
Magnum-sized condoms?
But this
Asking for a
actually,
friend.
This mirrors very clearly the problem that you have as to your question. And when you work in the Arctic, you have to come up. You're thinking out of the box the whole time, and you have to find solutions that are like this solution that actually work. And however crazy they are, then you try them. They won't, or they will. But the key rule for being a producer in the Arctic, even now when we have, it's so much easier just because equipment has gotten so much easier and lighter and that whole thing, and people's expectation of quality of visuals have also, they're different. So all of that helps, but the basic rule in production in the Arctic is you bring what you need, and what you didn't bring, you can't need. So you always have to be really aware of the fact that what may come up and you need to fix in whatever way, you have to be self-sufficient and be able to fix it, right? You know
That's
this very
totally
well.
true, yeah.
So you may be close to habited places, even big habited places like on an Arctic scale, but don't expect to have any resources. So just, if you expect your shoot to go well, you bring what you need, and what you didn't bring, you just can't need, and that's the basic rule.
Okay. No one waiting at the moment, so I will bring up another one. And well, I'm not an expert on filmmaking or anything like that, so I will have a somewhat different questions for you. So my next question is just for the panel, whoever wants to take this. How are the societies in the north, the small societies like the one we saw in your film, preparing for the changes that they are already feeling? I mean, the salmon is getting smaller and all that. And what's going to replace their way of life now? How do you see this?
That's a whole conference to answer.
I know. Well, how about you? Try to reflect on that.
I can tell you what we're doing. In Canada's Northwest Territories, most communities are still diesel dependent, for energy. We're quite isolated. I live in Yellowknife, which is the capital of the Northwest Territories, and it's a big city of 20,000 people. Mm-hmm. But most places in the north are like he described, the multiple plane trips to get there, small planes. Everything has to be flown into those communities, and so the cost of living is very high. As natural resources are like salmon and caribou, which are really important to people of the north, as the numbers go down, there's a lot of problems in the future. And one of the things that we are most dependent on for our economy is resource extraction, minerals, etc. And I grew up in that world. And I've made it my life's passion to sort of explore economic diversification in the Arctic, and particularly through the arts. Mm-hmm. So, as well as being a film producer and a director with my partner here, Jay, I'm a full-time volunteer lobbyist, to promote arts and culture as a viable, sustainable resource and economy. And I think there's a lot of room for growth there, and it's going to be vital for the North to be able to expand our capacity and our sustainability through sort of exports of those culture and arts products.
Thank you.
Well, in Alaska, there's a lot of competing forces on indigenous communities, especially off the road system, like in the YK Delta where this was filmed. And one of the things that complicates that is that subsistence rights for indigenous people in Alaska is written to our state constitution, which is a fantastic element that is different than all the other states in the United States. But one of the challenges is that then Fish and Game and other federal agencies have less autonomy over resource management because it does compete with that subsistence right. And so in someplace else, like say Washington, you could, in theory, close down a river and just say there's no fishing on this river for X amount of time, and that's not legally possible. And so how do you manage the communities that have to depend on that river? And then on the flip side, then you also have all the commercial interests that are dealing with it. So every fish that goes into that river has to get past all the different vessels that are fishing for the salmon in the ocean as they come in. And so how do you manage that, I think, is an incredibly difficult issue. And, on one hand, you have indigenous communities with limited voting power in Alaska, and then on the other hand, you have corporate interests as part of a for-profit component. And so Alaska is always trying to manage that, but it becomes very, very difficult. And I just want to say one other thing, just about in your story, when the man talks about how when he was a kid, the fish used to be 30, 40 pounds and stuff like that. That's not a fish story. Like in our, like of course, yeah, the fish were this big, you know, but in communities where, you know, oral traditions about hunting and all that, it's incredibly precise generation to generation because that information has been passed down as a tradition and knowing where to hunt and where to gather resources. And so you can 100% believe the gentleman when he says that the fish are smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Gabriel. I'm originally from the United States, but live here in Jamaica now. And I just had a question for Manuel. I was wondering if you've followed up with any of the people who appear in the film. You mentioned it was 7 years old, and I was just wondering sort of what the continuum has been for them.
So I haven't been in touch with the Waska family for a few years. So I stayed in touch for a while, but Ray's not really a tech person. I don't think he had an email account. So I haven't honestly been up to date with what's happening recently. I do know that the fishery has continued to be pretty successful. But I also know that the communities continue to struggle. I mean, one of the stories that was actually unfolding when we were there and has continued to unfold, which is pervasive and throughout Indigenous communities in the North, is the high rate of suicides. And when we showed up in this village, the first day we were there, a young boy committed suicide, and we didn't include it in the story because we didn't feel it was respectful to come in there and try and extract that story. But it was a profound part of, you know, the experience being there as a community dealing with that. And one of the reasons is the challenges they're facing with, you know, their culture being strained in so many ways, and the questions about where they go, what are they going to do with their lives. And so I've stayed very much abreast of what's happening in communities like those with the situation, and more of a broader issue. And then the salmon situation has been up and down. You know, it's been good year and bad, and I think that's the hard part, is it's not just like just depleting and they're kind of like, okay, we're going to plan to leave, we can't be here anymore. It's like 2 years of bad runs and then a huge run. And it's like there's seesaw back and forth like a yo-yo, and struggling, you know, how to make sense of it all. So I think that's just pervasive everywhere, is like climate change just makes everything so erratic. But, yeah.
Okay, we had another question there. Dr. Tulvan.
Hi, I'm Oscar with the American Embassy. I just had a question for everyone about what responsibility, if any, do filmmakers have when they're depicting communities that many of us have never been to or may never go to. I know Adam asked me if I'd ever been to Alaska, and I was ashamed to say that I hadn't. And most Americans have not been to Alaska. I'm sure most folks from Toronto have not been to Yellowknife. Other than just sort of the honesty that any filmmaker strives for, are there any added responsibilities when you're portraying a community on film that many of us may make our own impressions, may base our impressions based on what we see? And that could be for anyone, though. Thank you.
Yeah, we can start with this. Yes, of course, there are, just like when you enter any community anywhere, right? You've got the same responsibilities. But then we have certain things that have to do with the Arctic communities that, you know, if we just, because we have the topic filmmaking in the High North. For a start, we have the general filmmaking, which has become easier for everyone in the Arctic, Arctic people to do, because it's just less expensive to do these things now than it was, and it's easier. So that's something that means that there are more films and documentaries and shorts and whatnot coming out of the Arctic, made by Arctic people themselves. And Arctic people are storytellers, right? That's just what they are, like any people who are living in a part of the world where there's darkness and you can't really go outside for big parts of the year. So there's tremendous storytelling within all these communities, and that tends to always connect to nature, one way or the other, to survival. We have a huge documentary in the making, and this summer we did a part of that filming, the first part, and I was talking to one of Greenland's probably 3 biggest hunters, who happens to have worked with me for 20 years. He's my guiding light in Greenland anyway. He's the reason I'm alive. But, and that's no exaggeration. But, and we were standing on an island. We'd sailed like 700 kilometers out into nowhere. And it was a trip that you do not take except with people who are exceptional navigators in ice, like this guy. And he's sort of explaining his life there when he was there with his family, another family of 4, and that was it. And then they took a dog sled trip to trade, and they left on February 11th, and they arrived at the trading mission on June 15th. So that was the kind of life. And I asked him, okay, well, that little boy that was doing, playing down there with these rocks and doing this and this, did he dream of becoming this incredibly big, respected hunter that you are? And he answered, Wilbur, no, he didn't dream. Nobody thought beyond tomorrow. It was all about survival. So I'm just saying this, it's not directly related to your question, but that's very much where all the stories somehow ground. They are about survival one way or the other, and if you have memories are made up if you have food in your stomach or you didn't. So there's a whole lot of that kind of history there that we are seeing more and more of being made into films and documentaries, which is great. And that's something that should be done by the Arctic people themselves, because we cannot really, even us who have been with one foot in the Arctic communities for 30 years, we can't really tell those stories. They have to come from there. Then we have the reality of substance abuse, of alcohol abuse, of mental illnesses, of just human tragedy. And that is a very, very difficult subject to touch. Because, I've had one of my longtime partners in Greenlandic production almost shot because someone thought that someone said, are you the guy that was making this film? And he just said yes. And that was just it. Because there was a reaction of a local Inuit man, who mistakenly thought that my partner was the Christian that had done a Danish documentary about abuse in East Greenland. And he was just going to shoot him. So that sort of brought my attention to the fact that, wow, it really, if we ever work with these things, we really have to tread lightly, because you can't really portray these societies without touching upon this, because this is really the huge, big elephant in any room when it comes to Arctic discussion. I can't speak for Alaska and Canada, but I can speak for Greenland. And it's only now, like in East Greenland, it's only now that the local government and then Denmark is realizing what all of us have seen. It's been obvious from the first day I came there in 1996. And that's sexual abuse of children. But nobody wants to talk about it. And then you have outsiders talking about it, and that somehow always is too difficult for the local people to accept, and they don't really want to talk about it. But how are you going to make documentation on something like, for instance, this particular town without touching upon that? Because half of the people there, one way or the other, are affected emotionally or physically or mentally from that fact. So that's, for me, would be the answer of the thing that would be the most difficult thing, is when you really want to do something within these societies, how do you do it right? I know you have these same issues in Canada.
To repeat the question, it was, what would you do if you want to go work in northern communities?
Yeah, what responsibility do you feel? I mean, you always want to have the story be honest, but sometimes the first time you're telling the story for a lot of people, it's going to be for your work or for your work.
Okay, thanks. It's important to recognize where we are in history and how Arctic stories have been told in the context of media, film, and photography and stories like that. We're at the tail end of colonization and the impacts of that on the people of the Arctic, non-Indigenous and Indigenous. In Canada, an interesting thing that's happening now in our media landscape is the biggest Indigenous film festival in the world. I believe it's the biggest. It's called the Imaginative Film Festival in Toronto. They have a partner, or I guess part of the same organization as the Imaginative Film Institute, and they worked with federal funders of Canada to develop a document, a living document of research based on telling Indigenous stories. It's called On-Screen Protocols, is what it's called, telling stories of Indigenous, First Nations, and Métis people, and how to do that, especially as an outsider. That document spoke to dozens, if not hundreds, of Indigenous people across Canada about how they make films. So not just Indigenous people, but Indigenous storytellers, and how they make films responsibly. And the biggest thing that it always comes back to is accountability. Who are you accountable to? Who gave you permission to tell this story? Who authorized that? And the best way to tell stories of Indigenous peoples or people of the Arctic is to include those people. The saying in Canada now in Indigenous film circles is nothing about us without us. I'm not Indigenous, but I've been working by geographical sort of default. I've been working on Indigenous stories my entire career. And it's important to recognize that to tell those stories responsibly requires including people above the line, I guess, directors, writers, producers, at the highest level, people who will take ownership over the content of the story, that have some copyright, perhaps, and at the very least, if there's going to be any economic gain from it, that it happens, for those people as well. That's what we can do.
Sort of further to that, I think another important part is developing programs and opportunities for storytellers outside of the realm that of sort of classic documentary focus. Part of what we've done with Dead North is created an opportunity where younger people who are into horror movies and sci-fi and fantasy, I mean, the reality is that just because you're Inuit and you grew up in Uluhaktuk in Canada, it doesn't mean that the only thing that you're interested in is trapping or hunting. That's, you have access to internet in those places. You're watching Marvel movies. It's also the case that you're interested in that. So I think it's important to create opportunities where Indigenous voices and Northern voices can roam free in the larger context of creative filmmaking and creative storytelling.
Okay, and we had another question over there.
Hi, my name is Ben from Screen International. I'm just looking to understand a bit more the context of the social context of what you're talking about. And I wanted to know whether a birth rate of 9 children is typical. Is that, can anyone answer that? Just help me understand it.
I don't think I can speak with authority in any way about this, but just, I think, Ray's family, him and his wife had 9 children. And I think in his generation it was very common to have a lot of children. And but I can't speak with any authority beyond that.
I can give a little anecdotal information. So I had the good pleasure of working with an artist from Point Hope, Alaska, Ken Lisborn. Point Hope, if you look, is sort of the northwest corner of Alaska. It's actually the longest continuously habitated spot in North America. People have lived in Point Hope for 10,000 years. And I was asking Ken about growing up there, and he was significantly older than me. He just passed away last year. And I said, he said he was in a family of 17. And I said, 17, what'd your father do? And he's like, he was a hunter. And I was like, a good one, I imagine. He's like, yes. And I think partly it's culturally lends itself to larger families. And I think also, at least in Alaska, I don't think this is necessarily true of other parts of Canada, but the Eastern Orthodox Church is a very large part of Alaska culture. And so I think that also has tended to be a focus on larger families as well. So.
Waiting a question. So another one may be a little bit out of the topic, sorry about that. But I was thinking about, this film is about transferring knowledge between generations. And so I was wondering how can we make sure that this traditional knowledge that we're looking at in places like this continues to be transferred between generations if the societies are changing and they are kind of forced to take up new ways of life. The economy changes. And what is the role of your industry in is there a role, and what is the role of making sure that traditional knowledge isn't lost?
It's another question for a conference. Many conferences. I'll just share my experiences. I think there need to be stories that are told by people from the Arctic, from communities like Imanic, or from people who are lucky enough to be invited in and work in those communities that showcase the importance of those traditions in a positive way. I think that there's so many depictions of indigenous cultures everywhere and in the Arctic, which are either romanticized or showing purely the negative impacts of what's happening as a result of colonization and a very toxic system that dates back for so many hundreds of years. I think we need to show stories that honor the incredible cultural traditions that are embedded in those communities. So I think, going back to the previous question, I think if any time an outsider ends up in a community like this, I think we have to ask them, what kind of stories do you want us to tell? And it may be about fishing, but I have a friend who made a film in another Yupik community, and they said, we want to tell a story about basketball. Because basketball is really big in the Arctic. Like, Ray was a huge Lakers fan, huge. And the kids play ball all the time. In the summer, they're out there till 2 in the morning. In the wintertime, they're playing inside gyms. They travel around the state in these little planes in the middle of the storms playing basketball. And so she made a film, this filmmaker, with ESPN about basketball in the Arctic. And so I thought that was cool because it talks about like the fact that kids, they're watching Marvel movies, they're interested in NBA, and they're also talking about like coming together as a community and integrating like cultural traditions and songs and dances at the beginning of games. So it's like the evolving nature tradition that came from asking those questions. So I think there just needs to be so many ways that their culture is expressed, and the first thing we need to do is, or I do as a white person, is acknowledging that those traditions have so much value, and I have a tremendous responsibility if I'm invited into those spaces to work with those people to find a way to express that.
Who wants to go next?
I think this is really important, and I agree with every word, because there is a tendency, we see this in films, we also in our media, in the work that we do in terms of like Jonah. There is a tendency to cover indigenous people with such incredible, respect, if you like, misunderstood respect, that you lose the feeling that they actually eat and sleep and go to the toilet like any other person. And this sort of, I don't think that that portrayal, when the culture is somehow made so exclusive and so much bigger than the people behind it, that has been a tendency, and we've seen that. There is an interesting, I mean, it's interesting to look at Indigenous like in filmmaking, because on one hand we have just all the elements of Indigenous hunting life, be it hunting or fishing, are slowly being understood by lots of people in other places in the world that actually have the fundamental issues that make up for sustainable living, the way they think. Mm-hmm. A hunter goes out, he shoots a seal, one or two. This is a simplification, but you know, it's chopped up, it's put in a pot, and everyone eats out of the pot, and once you see the bottom, it's time to go out and shoot another. This is not the way we think in this society here or the US or anywhere. So there are certain ways of thought and how you go about and how you make use of nature that we all can learn so much about from Indigenous people. Films are a very good way to deliver that message, but then of course it has to also be interesting. It can't be, you know, in films that are only seen by people in the bubble that already understands. Mm-hmm. So that's one part which I find interesting about Indigenous filmmaking now, and especially like you're talking about the basketball film, and I remember there's a new film out of Canada called Grizzlies. That's a beautiful story which has an international appeal, but it's about a very local actual problem. But it's portrayed in a way that it can go way beyond that bubble, so to speak. So there's this, you know, should Indigenous filmmaking be about presenting the culture so that we can learn from it, presenting the culture so that it's preserved somewhere, or should it just be allowed to make films like everyone else?
Well, allowed, I mean, I think, as we know, in any place where there is a film, some kind of film industry, I mean, this needs lots of resources and infrastructure, and there's lots of things to make proper films or films that go out there. You need certain things, and I know there's something is happening in Greenland currently. I mean, there's some fund in the making, I understand that, or some movement in the making that will support some more concrete infrastructure, some knowledge and technical knowledge and also equipment. I mean, these things are necessary for all these creative people to tell their stories in a way so that they will come across and get out there properly. I mean, so this is something that needs to happen. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, no, but still, you know, just to say this, you know. I know there's lots of stories, endless stories, and how an endless way of how they want to portray them or tell them, these local people we are referring to. But we need to. There is a need to, you know, help them, make them happen.
I don't know if it connects with your work, but I mean, there has been some very positive development that originally comes out of the Sami Indigenous Film Fund in Finland, and then ends in the establishment of the Arctic Indigenous Film Fund, which covers the whole circumpolar Arctic. And it's very new, but the goals are very clear, and the good thing is that all these communities that in the big scale are very, very small and just some fractions of people in film on Earth, but at least with them having a platform to speak together, that is one of the most positive steps that I've seen in Indigenous film work or film production or whatever.
Yeah, we helped produce one of the films. It was a really cool initiative called The Last Walk. It was with the Sami Institute, where I think in Greenland, Canada, Nunavut, Alaska, maybe, they brought Indigenous filmmakers from all of those places. They all came together, came up with an idea for a story, and then they each went off and wrote their own version of that story, and then produced that story. It ended up being a really interesting project. But just sort of what you're talking about, I think one of the things I'm excited to see more of, and obviously I'm a white dude, I see my role as someone who can help facilitate productions at a higher level now, help with the technical side of things, and facilitate voices, new creative voices. I'd like to see something happen in the Indigenous communities, like Black Panther, what Black Panther did, what am I saying? What was the Marvel movie? Is that Black Panther? Yeah, like Afrofuturism for African American culture. I'd like to see that. I'd love to see that for Inuit culture or other Indigenous culture in Canada, and it's already starting to happen. We have a filmmaker that we know who just finished her first feature film, Nyla Inukshuk. She's an Inuit filmmaker in Canada. Her first feature film is not about seal hunting. It's not about anything traditional. It's about what happens in a small Inuit community when zombies or aliens attack. I'm not sure if it's zombies or aliens, but it's a group of small girls who have to defend their community against zombies or aliens. And I think that's rad because, we work a lot with elders, and it's always a wonderful experience, and there's a lot of honor and respect that goes around. But often what happens, and we were just at a storytelling festival, it was really primarily driven by elders, and they came up with what they wanted to see have happen. And as a result, none of the youth were involved. They all sat outside of the tent because the entire conference had to be in Clicho, which is the local language there. The elders decided they wanted it in that language because they want the youth to learn that language, but the youth currently don't speak that language. And all they're talking about is what they did back in the day. And I don't know how you guys feel, but when I was a 14-year-old sitting around and listening to old people talk, it was boring. And there's no reason to expect that that's different when you're an Indigenous 14-year-old. Like, just because you're Indigenous doesn't mean you're not bored by some of that stuff. So I think we also need to, sort of to your point, not always treat Indigenous people or Northern people with this air of reverence, like, just because you're Indigenous, you only want to talk about trapping or hunting or whatever. It's like, using our technical skills to allow new voices, new creative voices come up.
We've been talking a lot about Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous stories, but that's in part because of the place we're talking about. Your question actually was about Arctic stories and circumpolar stories, but that's the context, is these are mostly Indigenous communities. But one way that we can support these stories and these cultures and keep them vital is, well, there's two ways. We need to invest in cultural industries. We need to invest in storytellers. We need to invest in authors and writers and filmmakers from those places. And I don't just mean this as a corporations or as government public funding, but also as people who care about those stories, as investors. We can buy those books, we can go to those film festivals, we can share them on Facebook. The way to keep Arctic sovereignty in their stories is to support Arctic storytellers. And another big part that about a lot of the social issues that happen in the Arctic, those stories again need to be told by people of the Arctic, maybe with help from outside. But the way we do that is we invest again in education and in literacy, and I mean also in digital literacy. So giving people the tools and the vocabulary to be able to tell their stories, and that might mean doing photography workshops in a community of 25 people. It might mean bringing, a body of short films, sci-fi, fantasy, and horror films at the Dead North Film Festival. We might bring those to community to show people there some stories of people of the Arctic and what other realities exist. The Arctic and Indigenous people in particular don't exist only in museums. They're not in the past. These cultures are vital. They're alive and they're now. And like Jay said, people, young people in particular, they want to tell stories about their rad snow machine, going full blast, and they want to, explore other types of tales and not just the patriarchy of parachuting storytellers in from other places. They have a very narrow focus of what a story of the Arctic is about. It's important to lift up those stories. So go buy a book at the end of the day from an Arctic author. Go buy an album from an Arctic musician, and go to a film by an Arctic filmmaker.
I'll just say one last thing, if I may. I think that culturally, by and large, we've turned a corner. We've really started to put an emphasis on, and I struggle to use this word, but understanding the difference between authenticity and uniqueness. And in years past, stories of the Arctic would be like, if it's a uniquely Arctic story, then it was okay, and regardless of whether or not it was culturally sensitive or accurate or whatever. And I think now there's been a bigger emphasis on making sure that there's a level of authenticity in that story that's being told. And I think that consumers and producers have made a pivot towards craving that, and I think that by and large we're doing a better job of not confusing those two elements.
I would just like to add one thing to what you were saying, and I know I'm speaking for both of us. We have, in addition to the film work and stuff in Greenland, we've produced huge, big cultural events for the Nordic Council with brilliant young talent, just short of 20, 16, 17, 18. And then, of course, a lot of experience with young people in Greenland. And what strikes me so interesting is that not only seems the storytelling element it's just as much within young people as it is within the elders. That just seems to be something that just is in the genes. But also, and I'd be interested to hear if that's what you see as well in Alaska and Canada, if you have a creative person, whether that person calls him or herself an artist or a musician or a writer or whatever, they tend to be very creative on much more than one platform. So we have the established musician who also happens to be an actor who, by the way, wrote a script. And I find this so interesting. In these small communities, you get individuals that have these incredible talents and effects into so many cultural. Do you see this as well? Yeah.
Yeah, the oral storytelling tradition of Indigenous people in particular, and is shared by most people of the Arctic, I think, and by Indigenous people all over the world. This fellow can speak more to it, with the museum experience, but their entire DNA is filled with the data that has been collected by their generations and generations before, and their entire knowledge system is embedded in the language and in the types of words that they use and in the way that they use them. So it is really important that language from these regions is preserved. Those languages are textbooks, they're Bibles, they are encyclopedias. And so it is really important to hold on to language. And I think a way to do that is to expand the young people's opportunities to preserve language the way that they want to. Maybe that's with filmmaking, maybe that's with whatever it is, but the oral storytelling tradition, the elders that are such wonderful poets and knowledge keepers. I've seen really cool projects where a carver who's never touched a camera, is given an opportunity to work in film with some other people. and they're brilliant. Their stories are not, they're not, I don't know, you see so much shit on TV that looks the same. You know, you hear so much music on the radio that it's just the same, it's homogenous. And stories of the Arctic are not. They're quite distinct, they're quite unique. And so giving tools and voice and platform and funding and investments into Arctic storytellers in whatever capacity, whether they are a filmmaker, invite them to be a filmmaker. Let them explore music with you and raise their voices. Yeah, because they have incredible stories to tell.
So we had a question over there.
I'm Zena Asi. I'm from Tribeca Film Institute. I really appreciate what you're saying. And if you'll all allow me to just share this uneasiness with you, I find it really interesting that we're having a conversation about the Arctic region, which largely affects First Nations folks, and I don't know how many of them are in the room with us today. You all sort of were speaking to that point, is that we really can't afford to do that anymore. We are at a point in the world, in this sort of, besides the climate crisis, just this total global misunderstanding of each other, that I don't think we are any more excused in that sense. So under that umbrella, I'm very curious to hear how the communities have responded to your film, and how has this film contributed to this sort of global conversation about this climate crisis. And if you'd allow me to also share, there's this wonderful journalist who wrote in The Guardian as a response to, and this is similar, if you'll just bear with me, who wrote an article in response to having Lena Dunham write a script about a Syrian refugee. And she ended her article by saying, build the mic, fund the mic, hold the mic, but get off the damn mic. It's not ours to hold anymore. Who holds the camera holds a lot of power and perspective and really profound sort of authority that even if it's a collaborative project can sometimes, miss. So I'm just really curious how we would move forward from here without having anyone here in the room, so that we're not speaking about them, but we're hearing from them. And that's something I appreciate in your film, because I feel like I was spending time with the character, and he was sort of drawing me into his life and his journey. But I'm just curious how their response was to the film and just in general.
Well, firstly, thank you for acknowledging the fact that there is no Indigenous presence here on this panel or in this room, because that is a problem and something that really needs to be thoughtfully addressed in any situations like this where we're talking about these issues. So as far as how they responded to the film, I was unable to go back to the community myself to screen the film. Just very practically, it's very expensive to go there and very hard to get there. The fishery who invited us to tell the story of their community and the relationship to salmon, which is really what they were interested in. When I reached out to them, they were like, "Are you interested in profiling the fishery?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I think I'd love to just come and spend some time there and tell a story about the connection between salmon and the people in Amonic." And they said, "Okay, great. Well, we'll just help you whatever way we can." They screened the film to the community, or whoever came to the community gym on that night. And the response that they shared with us was positive. So they said, I think the family, what they conveyed, what Ray said is, "Oh, it's great to see us on camera." He didn't say a whole lot of words, but he said, I think he appreciated, this is what he shared with us, actually, not even when the film was made, but just at the end of the time with them, is he appreciated our interest in talking about, his relationship to salmon. He loves fishing, so he loved that we were interested in telling a story about him teaching fishing to his grandkids, because to him that's the most important thing. You know, he wants his, as he said, like, I know I've done my job because my kids are going to learn how to fish, even if fishing may not be around in the same way that it was, which is implied, right? But that's what he cared about. He's like, well, it was great being able to me talk about the most important thing that to my life and do it on camera. And so I think that the response has been positive, and the film premiered on National Geographic, and it got a lot of positive response as far as exposure. But honestly, I don't really know what it was like for other Arctic communities, indigenous communities, to screen the film. But they did exhibit it for quite a while at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, which I was really happy about because it was in a context which I felt was, you know, a good space to share this kind of story. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing to your wonderful question? We can't forget the fact that there are not just indigenous people in the Arctic, right? I don't have the figure in my head, but I think it's like there are about 4 million people that are said to be living in the Arctic and the subarctic, and of them there are about 500,000 indigenous people when you go from Russia and the whole circle. So this is a tendency. We tend to forget the normal people of the Arctic that aren't indigenous.
Okay. So I'm thinking, we often hear people say what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. There's the whole aspect of globalization, climate change, how that all links. Do you feel that your work, what you're doing, reaches far outside of the Arctic as much as it should? Does it reach the right people? Do you think that you're contributing to kind of communicating the Arctic culture, making it obvious to maybe those who see economic opportunities and see the ice melting and new shipping routes and all that? Do you think that, are you contributing to kind of making them see that they will have effects on the societies and that there are people living there and they have their own culture and they need to preserve that? Do you reach far enough?
I don't think we ever reach far enough, but we can try our best as storytellers to put those stories out there. So, but I think so much needs to be done.
I mean, with the Dead North Film Festival, that's the entire point. That's why we created it. We created it 8 years ago because I went to a local film festival and I didn't see any northern voices on camera. And sort of to your point, by northern I mean people who live in the north, so not just indigenous, but you know also the other people who for generations have lived there and lived the Arctic experience. So we created the Dead North Film Festival in order to encourage people to tell stories in a different way from a uniquely northern perspective. And lo and behold, it's become wildly popular. And you know, in the last 8 years, we've had 170 short films made. Yeah. Those films have traveled, and so part of our goal at the festival is not only to provide a high-level opportunity for people to screen their films to a sold-out audience and get the red carpet treatment, whether or not you're an indigenous person from a small community, you know, way high up north, or from Yellowknife, one of the bigger cities, you get the same treatment. We've had films made by 8-year-old indigenous kids from one of the local schools, and they got flown to Toronto to screen their film at the Blood in the Snow Film Festival. They got treated like rock star directors. We've had other filmmakers who've had their films chosen to screen at Cannes, at the Cannes Not Short on Talent program, and other festivals around the world. So that's our goal, you know, is to actually, they make a movie and then we help them get it out to the world. Because as much as we need to see more indigenous filmmaking, what I think is also really important to keep an eye on is there needs to be more northern focus. I want to see more northern voices on camera. Just the Arctic, living in the Arctic, that the experience of remote life cold as shit, you know, all of that. We want to see more of that and less of like what it's like to live downtown Toronto.
Yeah, one way to help with that is, you know, I think this is probably universal for most of the Arctic filmmaking community is by default we become a location and we become service providers. And that's an important part of the toolbox of economic diversification, of like carrying on stories. But it's also an old-fashioned way of telling stories. You know, Hollywood coming to Iceland to film Game of Thrones. It's beautiful. It you know puts a lens on Iceland and makes it a place that everybody wants to come. But as much as I want to watch the next episode or the last episode of Game of Thrones, I want to see stories from Icelandic filmmakers. You know?
The very essence of your question is exactly the reason why the Journal of the North Atlantic and Arctic was created. A few years back, the original idea came about because of very many very strange stories and headlines coming from the Arctic that were in no context with reality, kind of fabricated bullshit. And because Vilborg has all this background, and I'm also a partner of hers for a while in co-productions and such, we kind of joined forces with some other good people and have been on this mission because of what you were saying, because this is this part of the world should be represented in a better way. I know that the Journal of the North Atlantic and Arctic, Jonah, is not currently a film platform, but it will be in its own right, in its own way later on. But we have a lot of stories there that are more accurate.
Also, to add to this, to your question on who is being reached. We are, in our project, we are 22 editors, photographers, documentary makers, journalists from 9 countries in the almost all of the circumpolar Arctic. That will be all of the circumpolar Arctic very soon. And the interesting thing is that what we see, we have a platform where it's a journal. We're always sort of hanging on to that name because it's not news. And so what we have these really long, detailed stories that are written by people that are on the ground, that are streetwise in their part of the region, and then fantastic photography. That's sort of our trademark. And interestingly, all articles that we publish that have to do with, directly have to do with the indigenous something, whether they are cultural, whether they are the Nenets or they are the Inuits or the Samis, whether they touch upon policy something, business something, cultural something. These are the articles that are read outside of the Arctic the most. And we have huge reading in the US, but we also have huge reading in India, and we don't know why. But there you go. If there's an article that has icebergs or ice caves or people in sealskin clothes, we have thousands of people coming in from India. We don't promote ourselves. So that's just interesting. But I mean, there are, of course, the highest reading we have is sort of on the border of our region. But if it's these topics, then the interest very, very clearly is more from outside of it than from northern person to northern person. So if that answers.
I'll just add one thing is that, you know, we hear the terms, for people who are not in the Arctic, I don't live in the Arctic, I'm not, most of the people on this panel, I made a film in Yupik, and then I made a feature which one of the characters was based in northern Alberta, which feels very Arctic in a lot of the time of the year. But we hear terms like the Arctic all the time now. Arctic melting, impact in the Arctic region. And it becomes like, I was talking to somebody just earlier today, like these big terms like white noise, you know, we don't really understand it. We hear about this all the time. We hear about climate change, the effect on people, but we're just blasted by these terms so often they lose a meaning. I know from myself, just the little experience I've had being in those communities, not talking about even making a film, but just being in those communities and hearing people talk about the effects of what's happening and how it's affecting them, often in a much more pronounced way than it's affecting people in the South, at least in, not the global South, but in North America. So it felt like I actually could understand what was happening because they shared stories with me. And I could connect what was happening. So there's like a connected thread between me and the term Arctic, which isn't just a word that's arbitrarily told me to help maybe think about climate change. I'm thinking about Ray's family, or I'm thinking about the Ranchi. I'm thinking about these people. And yeah, most people can't go to those places, but when you communicate stories about the Arctic, it helps people understand what's happening because it puts a human face on it. And there's a connection, and I think we really need those more. I won't even want to call them emotional because I feel like that's too shallow. I feel like deeper cultural, place-based connections to what's happening to help us understand and digest and witness what's going on in the world today.
I think it's also important to what you're saying. The fact that, what's the role of all this? That we see these things very clearly up north. We see the tongue of the glacier that was here 2 years ago and is over there now. We see, like, just a couple of months ago, I came to this really small settlement in East Greenland. And normally I've been there quite often, and normally I wake up at 3 o'clock in the night because all of the dog howl at the same time. And I didn't wake up, and I was like, maybe they moved them. Of course they hadn't moved them. The fact is simply that they've had to slash like half the dog population because it's expensive for a hunter to keep dogs. They need 12 of them for a team. And if you can't really use them for the largest part of the winter, then why? And they can't. It's getting shorter and shorter, the period that they're safe to take their dogs on dog sleighs out of the ice, so they all are swifting to boats. And so, you see all of this up north. We see it here in Iceland clearly. But the thing is, there's such a big part of the world where people are feeling already or will be feeling very severe impact from the climate changes that are visible up north without having any visual way of understanding why this is happening. So we tend to think that everyone knows what the Arctic is, but a big part of the planet's population has no idea what this is. So that's also another important thing to relay the information about the North, about what's happening there, for people in other parts of the world to have some chance of understanding all kinds of devastation that is coming to them.
This panel feels a bit heavy, talking about all this stuff. No, that's fine. So, and I don't mean to disparage, the words that are coming out of, my first love is documentary. I was a photojournalist first. I really appreciate your filming. I like that type of work a lot. But if I can, I'd like to, I know we have a little bit of time left. I want to show you some Northern storytellers telling Northern stories and what it felt like for them to do that. And they're not documentaries, but it's important to note that giving people voice means letting them use the voice that they want in the way that they want to. And Dead North is a genre festival, meaning sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. There's a lot of, just like in heavy metal and other types of expression, there's a lot you can release in telling a story that isn't just a documentary. We have all kinds of climate change stories that appear in our horror movies. We have all kinds of cultural genocide type stories that appear in sort of a sci-fi way in the film. You can talk about heavy shit in fun ways sometimes, and probably more effectively.
Absolutely.
I don't want to start naming names, but yeah, so if we can, I'd like to play, I think we have about 10 minutes left. 5. Okay, we do have time? Okay, so let's play the...
So can we just say thank you and move over there so we can see?
Yeah.
Okay, so thanks everyone. Thank you.
Before you... Thank you. I apologize for stealing the end of the show here, but I just think this puts an exclamation point at the end of this beautiful panel. Thank you all for sharing it with me. I want to play 2 short videos. So the first one is the Dead North promo, and this is a very small documentary that shows what it was like to participate in Dead North for Dead North filmmakers. And then after that, further to some other questions, I want to play right afterwards a film called The Rip Trailer. So Dead North has become a vehicle not only for promoting short film, which short film is a very special art form that not a lot of people understand. It's its own genre, short film. It's not just a feature film condensed. It has a beginning, middle, and end that exist only in a short film world. So that's what this is about. But we have also expanded the cinematic universe of Dead North. And Jay and I have partnered with a production company in the Yukon to develop Dead North TV, which lives in the circumpolar cinematic universe, sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, much like Black Mirror or Twilight Zone or one of those types of projects. And I just want to show you where this short film thing can lead. These are made for no money, quite intentionally. It's an equal playing ground across the Arctic for anybody. We want you to make this with your friends, some professionals, some emerging filmmakers, and see what you can do with the limited capacity in the coldest, darkest time of the year. But then we want to take the best and the brightest, the first-time Indigenous female director, the old white dude who's been making it for 40 years, documentaries and stuff. We're going to take these people and invite them to create a show with us called Dead North TV, and it's going to hopefully exist all across the Arctic.
I'm glad that I did it because it's healing and awesome, and glad to see how much our community